Hey everyone, what's going on? This is Mr. Bear, and thanks for joining me for today's video on Lyndon B. Johnson and the Great Society. Today we're going to be looking at the successes and the failures of Lyndon B. Johnson. So let's get into it. On November 22nd, 1963, the nation lost President John F. Kennedy, and within hours, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson had taken the oath of office. And as the nation mourned, Johnson brought leadership to the executive branch. LBJ, no, not that LBJ, this LBJ, was a Texas Democrat, which is a really rare political combination, who helped Kennedy win over conservative Republican votes in the South during the 1960 election. Now, with Johnson taking over, let's go over a little bit of his resume. He grew up extremely poor, and his first job out of college was as a teacher at a segregated school in Texas. Now, Johnson is then going to move into politics during the Great Depression, and he's going to begin writing letters to this girl named Lady Bird. And on their first date, Johnson is actually going to ask Lady Bird to marry him, which is definitely a bold move. And Lady Bird was an extremely intelligent woman who was also extremely wealthy. And so she is going to help Johnson's political career by basically bankrolling everything. Now together they're going to have two kids, Linda Bird and Lucy Baines, and they're also going to have two beagles named Him and Her. Following this, Johnson is going to serve in the Navy, and he is then going to become a senator, where he is going to be known as a master politician. So when he enters the White House, he is going to have a strong reputation as being a big fan of FDR. He was actually mentored by FDR and a big fan of the New Deal. Now, part of the reason that Johnson was such a master politician was because he always got his way. At 6'4", Johnson was an imposing figure who was known for his in-your-face style of leadership. He often bullied senators into doing what he wanted, and this was called the Johnson treatment. Johnson would also make his subordinates extremely uncomfortable by often holding meetings while he was on the toilet or in bed. Now, when Johnson takes over, we see a man who wants to continue the legacy of John F. Kennedy, and his first real success was passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which had been pushed for by Martin Luther King. And this is a really important win for the Civil Rights Movement. However, his biggest policy objective was something called the War on Poverty.
This administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America.
At the time, 22.5% of Americans lived in poverty. Johnson wanted to end poverty because his own poor upbringing allowed him to understand the impact of what it was like to live in poverty. His first action was the Economic Opportunity Act, and this legislation provided $1 billion for job training for young adults aged 16 to 24 to move out of poverty. He also created VISTA, which sent volunteers to poverty-stricken areas of the country to help those in need. And so you can really see he is attempting to help individuals get themselves out of poverty. As this was going on, Johnson was fighting for re-election against Republican Barry Goldwater, whose slogan was AUH2O. And if you don't get that, just ask a friend. Because of Johnson's war on poverty, the big question of the election was, what is the role of the federal government in society? Johnson wanted to use the federal government to provide rights to all Americans. This is sort of a liberal perspective. Goldwater, a conservative from Arizona, wanted to have limited federal government involvement and place more power in the hands of state. And this is a classic liberal conservative discussion. Now, Johnson is going to win the election in a landslide. Upon winning the election, Johnson is going to announce an expansion of his war on poverty with a new plan called the Great Society, and this is reminiscent of FDR's New Deal. The Great Society was Johnson's domestic agenda to expand the war on poverty, address racial injustice, and really do all the things listed here. And you can really tell, he's got his work cut out for him with this list. Through the Great Society, Johnson and Congress are going to pass over 200 pieces of legislation. That's a lot of work. And this is going to drastically increase the power of the president and the federal government. And this is based on Johnson's belief that if he can reduce poverty, this will boost the economy and hopefully create a stronger workforce. Now, in the next few slides, I'm going to quickly and efficiently try to explain some of this key legislation. Up first is the 1965 Voting Rights Act to address racial injustice. We've talked about this. This is a major achievement for the civil rights movement. It ends discriminatory voting practices like poll taxes and literacy tests. and this is right after the Selma March. Next up, the Great Society addresses environmental issues, and LBJ is the first president since Teddy Roosevelt to work on environmental protection, and he passes a bunch of different pieces of legislation to address water, clean air, and also wilderness protection. Probably two of the most important pieces of legislation from the Great Society are Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare provided low-cost health care to those 65 and older. Medicaid serves those living in poverty or those who are disabled with low-cost health care. And this is important because Medicare and Medicaid are programs used by millions of Americans today. Every time you pay into Social Security in your paycheck, you are paying towards these programs. Next up, the Great Society addressed education, which was a real problem in the 1960s. By 1964, 8 million Americans had only finished 5 years of school or more, and only 75% of Americans had finished high school. That's compared with 90% today. So LBJ creates this program called Head Start, which provided free preschool to families who could not otherwise pay for it. And today, Head Start preschools are all over the country, and it's really an awesome program, providing over a million children a year with education. Additionally, he is going to provide funds for a new network called the Public Broadcasting Station, or PBS, and a TV show to educate young Americans called Sesame Street. So you can thank LBJ for Elmo, Cookie Monster, and Big Bird. Additionally, he set aside funding for a program called the 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act. The Great Society is going to address urban housing by creating the Department of Housing and Urban Development, also known as HUD, and this is a new cabinet position which provides grants and home loans to those who are attempting to buy a house but are living in poverty. And so by this point, I am almost completely out of breath, and LBJ is going to pass so many different programs that I can't even cover them all. So here is a list explaining even more programs. The judicial branch is also going to support the liberal activism of LBJ. The Supreme Court under Chief Justice Earl Warren is going to decide on a number of monumental issues protecting constitutional rights for those accused of crime. Key cases include the 1963 Gideon v. Wainwright case, which gives all American citizens the right to a lawyer, and the 1966 Miranda v. Arizona case, which basically says that you must be read your constitutional rights before talking to police, and I'm sure many of you have heard of your Miranda rights. Hopefully this is never read to you. Looking at the legacy of the Great Society, people still debate how successful it was. It is certainly the biggest expansion of the federal government since the New Deal. Liberals point out that some of the successes are that it did see a drastic decrease in poverty, provided health care to millions, educated millions, provided rights to accused criminals, and had tons of programs that were created that are still around today. Conservatives point out that it expanded the national debt, took away control from states, and did not really eliminate poverty. Sadly, spending on the Vietnam War is going to ultimately kill the Great Society, and Johnson is only going to run for one term. He's not going to run in the 1968 election, and as a result, presidents like Nixon and Reagan are really going to chop up the Great Society during their presidencies. Ultimately, though, the issues Johnson attempted to fix are still around today, and if you look at the facts, you can be the judge of whether Johnson did ultimately succeed in creating a great society. Thanks for watching.
The Great Society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to poverty and racial injustice, to which we're totally committed in our time.